Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Pat Flynn, and welcome back to the I Thought You'd Like to Know show. We have what I think is going to be an extremely exciting episode for you tonight. We're going to tackle a big question. Oh, perhaps one of the biggest questions, and certainly something that comes up often in religious debate. And that question is, can a person be good without God? Can a person be moral without God? And I have a great story. Well, it might not be a great story, but I have a story that leads up to this. And we're going to spend some time on philosophy as well. Like philosophy as such, why philosophy is important, why it matters, what makes for good philosophy. And then we're going to back this into this moral argument. Can a person be moral without God? And then if we have time, I know this is an ambitious project, but if we do have time, I want to see if we can use the existence of objective morality. If we can establish that, I want to see if we can use that as an argument for God's existence. Now, why does this topic interest me tonight? Well, I spent about 4 hours today down in a philosophy classroom at a local state university by my house, arguing these very subjects. It was with a professor who is an existentialist. It was an intro to ethics class, and I went in and I gave the case for God and objective morality, and boy, did we get into it. The class was only supposed to be 2 hours, but me and the professor went way over time. And like I said, she is an existentialist. She didn't clarify if she was an atheist, but I believe she is, because she's a moral relativist also. And I was there to give my best case to try to save these students from what I believe is the danger and absurdity of moral relativism, of just this idea that morals really boil down to a person's likes and dislikes and preferences and so on, and that you should decide on various ethical theories based on whatever values you happen to prefer. And we'll get into relativism and the problems with that later on. But let it be known, I jumped at the opportunity to go and argue the case for objective morality, for God, bringing God back into the college campus. God is not popular. It doesn't seem on secular campuses these days. It was, I would say most of the students were engaged and seemed somewhat indifferent, and there was a few hostile, somewhat atheistic-leaning students in the class, and we had a good show. We had a good run of arguments. It was a rigorous debate, and I thought, well, why not bring this experience onto the I Thought You'd Like to Know show? Ask the question, can you be moral without God? Because I am sure that this is something that all of you as Christians and Catholics have probably run into it at some point. And maybe you have a sense that morality doesn't make sense without God, but maybe you haven't really thought about it on the philosophical level or tried to establish that argument. So if I can help you to establish that, because you're right, by the way, you're absolutely right. I'm here to affirm that you are in the correct position, as I tried to argue in this class. But I want to give you the tools to make this argument, so that way if it comes up at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, we can battle down the relativists who might be lurking in the family. Or if you happen to be a student or something like that, and a philosophy professor starts to try to impose moral relativism on people, which is kind of a funny thing, right? As a moral relativist, where do you get off imposing your relative values on other people? It seems somewhat self-defeating, doesn't it? We'll get into that. But part of what really struck me was the lack of good philosophy, the lack of good arguments. And this wasn't, I wouldn't say that this was that everybody in this class was a newcomer to philosophy, but even to the professor, is a lot of the discussion was based on mere assertions and opinions and feelings. I was having the conversation with the professor and another student, And she said, well, everything you're saying is just your opinion. And I said, well, no, I have arguments to back up my opinion. My opinion is really relevant. Either the arguments that I've laid out are successful or they're not successful. And she said, well, it's just your opinion that they're good arguments. And I said, hold on a minute. Hold on a minute. Have we taken a class in logic yet? Have we really learned what philosophy is about? So it was very bizarre to me, because it wasn't what I would expect out of a philosophy class. It just struck me as somewhat lacking in philosophical acumen, both of the students and the professor. So I wanted to spend some time on why it's important that we get philosophy right, so that way we can have arguments. And I think we start with this idea of an argument. Like, what makes for a good argument? And I after class, I talked with this student for a while, and she was great. She was very, very sweet. We had an awesome conversation afterwards, but this is kind of the conversation that I had, is philosophy is love for wisdom. And when we say arguments and philosophies, we don't mean opinions, and we certainly don't mean an argument in the sense that we might hear it more commonly, like, oh man, I had a really bad argument with my wife tonight, or I had an argument online and that person was such a jerk. That isn't what we mean when we say argument in philosophy. Very simply put, an argument in philosophy is reasons for a conclusion. It's giving reasons to believe that something is or is not the case, that something is or is not true, that something does or does not correspond with reality. That's all an argument is. So it's important to understand that arguments don't have personalities. You know, sometimes in debate, people are like, oh, well, that's a very arrogant point of view. Well, if you're presenting an argument, you have to address the argument, the steps in an argument, the conclusion, the validity, the soundness. We'll get into all this. It's actually not that complicated. It's really not. There's only about 9 or so rules of logic that need to be adhered. And you don't even need to really have those all formally memorized to stage successful arguments. But I want to reaffirm what philosophy is about. If philosophy is about love of wisdom, we have to not only not avoid arguments, but actively encourage argumentation. It shouldn't be just about like, oh, well, you have your opinion and your feelings, and you have your opinion and your feelings, and they're equally valid. Well, if that's true, then you have to give me some type of argument to think that that is true. And I have plenty of arguments to think that that isn't true, and we will get into some of those tonight, like I said. So let's just spend a little bit of time before we start making these arguments about morality to understand what an argument is and how to make a good argument. There's a joke that I heard when I first started studying philosophy. I think I forget who told this to me, and I forget who the quote is from. I'm terrible at attribution. But the quote was something like this. You know, a kid walks into Philosophy 101, and the professor says, "Good news. After this class, you will never lose an argument again. Bad news. Nobody will ever know it." And it's so true. Most people don't know what makes for a good argument. A lot of times people are taken in and persuaded by people who are charismatic or funny or witty, but they might not actually be making a valid point. On the other hand, people might ignore people who are not charismatic, not witty, not funny, but who might be making exceptionally good points. So it's important to understand what actually makes for a good argument. And I want to outline why this is important, just kind of like for life in general. I'm going to try and make an argument for why it's important to understand what makes for a good argument. So the first reason I would say is, so you're not fooled by people who are obviously wrong, right? We don't want to be taken advantage of. We don't want to believe certain positions that are wrong just because somebody was charismatic, witty, funny, charming, etc., right? We want to be able to detect when bad arguments are being made so we aren't led to wrong conclusions. It's just kind of a foolproof BS detector, if you want to put it that way. So it's one way to protect yourself from being deceived. That's one reason why I think you should study the art of the philosophical argument. The second is so you can go from a state of understanding less to understanding more by hearing from and studying people who are seemingly not wrong, who actually are making good arguments. So it's just the reverse of what we just said. Not only will you be able to prevent yourself from reaching irrational conclusions, but hopefully by studying people who are making good arguments, hearing good arguments, you will be able to advance your understanding and knowledge of the truth as well, and be able to evaluate people's claims and go from a state of understanding less to understanding more by, again, understanding what makes for a good argument. So we have to understand what makes for a good argument before we can go from understanding less to understanding more, et cetera, et cetera. All right, the third is, of course, more of the positive case, where then you go out and you can present your case and your position lucidly and soundly to others, and who knows, maybe even convincingly. Now, it's really important to know that even if you have a great argument, it doesn't mean that people are going to be convinced by it. There's absolutely no way that you can guarantee certainty of an argument. People could deny arguments for all kinds of irrational reasons. People can always dial up skepticism very unfairly just because they don't want to accept a conclusion. And this is why the next part of talking about argumentation is important, because you do want the right expectations when it comes to philosophical argument, so that way you're not bluffed by the extreme skeptic who says, you have to prove something to me with 100% certainty, like a geometrical equation. But philosophy is not about proving things in the sense of a geometrical equation. When we use the term proof in philosophy, we mean more of a rational demonstration. So the certainty is an unreasonable expectation, because so many people are coming from emotional points of view with certain prejudices, certain biases, that they will unfairly deny certain premises of an argument or a conclusion simply because they just don't like it. They don't want to accept it. So that's really important to make note of. So on that end, like, what is a good argument then? Well, I would say this. A good argument is simply one that is convincing, one that persuades reasonable people who are open-minded. That's a good argument, and I'll define that a little bit more. A great argument is one that is compelling, one that persuades even unreasonable people. And most of the time, a good argument is enough. That's all you need. So a good argument to me is simply one where the premises and the conclusion are more plausibly true than not. I'll say it again. A good argument is simply where the premises and the conclusion are more plausibly true than not. That doesn't mean that you've proved things with 100% certainty. You have just established a case of plausibility whereby you are well within your rational rights to accept it, and to the degree that it is more plausible than not, you probably should accept it. So that is the reasonable expectation of what makes for a good argument. Now, I think we have some great arguments when it comes to things like the existence of God and moral values and things like that. But we don't have to go in thinking we have to prove something to people with 100% certainty. That is a will of the wisp. It's a fantasy. It's largely never going to happen. We're dealing with people here, and people are going to be skeptics just to be skeptics sometimes. So what is the goal then, I would say, when forming an argument? Well, the goal when forming an argument, and what I tried to do in this class that I was so fortunate to be a part of, was simply raise the intellectual stakes. That's what you want to do when arguing. You want to raise the intellectual stakes to such a position that for somebody to violate those stakes would occur, that would cause them to seem very irrational, or cause them to undermine their intellectual credibility, or to appear absurd in some way. And that, to me, is all you need for a good argument. If you can do that, then I think you've successfully made an argument. And even if that person doesn't accept it, so what? That doesn't matter. You set the premises and the conclusions such that the plausibility was so high that they seem really silly for denying it. And even if they still deny it, that's totally fine. And there we go. I mean, so a classic example would be something like this. I can logically imagine not having a head, right? Right. This is true. I can logically imagine not having the head, that I could be who just are like to do the Matrix or something like that. But I have every good reason to believe that I have a head based off of something called a properly basic belief, which we will get into. Now, somebody might deny that you have a head, And then could just simply say, that's fine, you can do that, but I don't think philosophy is going to cure you of that. I think at that point you need an actual doctor, and that was one of G.K. Chesterton's famous quips about people who just are skeptics to be skeptics to an extreme degree. And you see this all the time. People are generally not that skeptical in life, right? They only become that skeptical typically when you start arguing against a position that they hold. And we see this all the time in philosophy, especially against atheists, right? Atheists typically, through daily life, do not require anywhere near the amount of certainty to get along with their daily life that they do when it comes to God's existence. Not even close. Right? Somebody who's married, right, and they're an atheist. They are assuming so much on faith in a relationship that person loves them, is going to be loyal to them, and you can never prove that with a certain mathematical certainty, obviously not, or empirical investigation by any means, but you might have very good reasons to believe that your spouse does love you and is faithful to you. You have your history together. You have your vows, and you've experienced this person on a very personal, intimate level. You trust them. You have good reasons to believe that something is the case. And so we see people go along with that all the time, and occasionally they are wrong. But the point is, if atheists apply the level of skepticism they typically do to the arguments for God's existence to all other areas of their life, it would look like a really dysfunctional and probably very sad existence. So just keep that in mind, and that's why I want everybody to have the right expectations about what actually makes for a good argument. Give up the idea of certainty or even being able to compel everyone to a conclusion. It's probably not going to happen. And remember, a lot of argument and debate, this is important. When I went into that philosophy class, I did not necessarily expect to convince or compel the existentialist philosopher to suddenly become a theistic philosopher. I didn't think that would happen. Maybe we'll continue the conversation. I thought that I had good arguments, but it wasn't just a debate between me and that professor. There was an audience. So sometimes the utility in a debate isn't necessarily to convince your opponent or the person you're arguing against, but any number of potential onlookers who may not have made up their mind yet. And I can tell you that this generally seemed to be the case for the class, who has not seemingly spent a lot of time on moral values and systems of ethics and so on. So just simply by presenting my case and not letting the professor present hers alone, I can't confirm it, I didn't take a survey after class, but I very well may have persuaded some people over to the realm of objective moral values and away from moral relativism. And I hope that I did that. And again, I think I offered some really good arguments that I would like to share with you as we move through our discussion tonight. And I hope this is interesting, and if you want to call in and join the old discussion at any point, you are certainly welcome to do so. The number is 515-604-9344. Access code is 914121. 515-604-9344. Access code 914121. Come on, ask questions, debate with me. I've been debating all day. I'm in a debating mood. So if we want to do that, we can certainly do that. Otherwise, I'm going to continue on here. I also want to recommend a book that I think might be helpful to everybody here, and that would be Peter Redpath's The Moral Psychology of St. Thomas Aquinas, and you can find that on enroutebooksandmedia.com. Search for Moral Psychology. So we'll recommend a few more resources toward the end for people who want to dig a little bit deeper into this. So before we move into the moral argument, let's just talk about arguments in general for just a little bit more, because there's just a few more things that I want to know. And specifically, we haven't actually defined what an argument is or the steps in an argument. So when I've been talking about argument, I'm really talking about a deductive argument. And what is a deductive argument? Well, a deductive argument, as Aristotle once taught us, is really an argument that requires a series of steps that forcibly draw a conclusion. And as Aristotle taught us, we only need, in a deductive argument, we only really need 2 steps to draw a conclusion. What are the steps in an argument? Well, the steps would be called premises. Okay? And what do I mean when I say forcibly draw a conclusion? Well, in a deductive argument, it's important to understand that if the premises are true and the logic is valid, then the conclusion follows necessarily. Okay? I will give you an example of this form of argument when we get into the moral debate. But I'll give you another example now. So a deductive argument, the classic one that you typically hear, would be this. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates was a man. Conclusion, Socrates was immortal. So here we have 2 premises, which are the steps in an argument, whereby if these premises are true, and the logic valid, meaning we're not committing a non sequitur, we're not just dropping something in there arbitrarily, then this conclusion follows necessarily. Meaning if all men are mortal, if Socrates was a man, then it follows with absolute certainty. And I know we said certainty as a will of wisp before, but I meant that in like a convincing way. But in a deductive argument, it means that the conclusion is automatic and unavoidable. If we affirm the premises, the conclusion follows automatically and unavoidably. That is a deductive argument. An inductive argument is more about gathering data points and evidence to form a general theory that is probabilistic, either stronger or weaker. That's more of the sciences. We can save that for another time, perhaps. But a deductive argument is more in philosophy and logic. And we can use science to support premises in a deductive argument. And deductive arguments often argue deductive arguments often argue reverse of inductive arguments. So if in inductive arguments in science we're looking at particulars and trying to establish a universal theory, deductive is often the opposite, meaning we start at a universal, like all men are mortal, and we argue down to a particular instance, such as Socrates was a mortal. So the 2 things you have to really pay attention to, without doing a full course on logic, for a deductive argument is this. One, that the logic is valid, meaning, here's what that means. It means if the premises are true, the conclusion would follow. Okay, that's what a valid argument means. But just because an argument is valid doesn't mean that it's true. For example, let me think of something here real quick. Okay, premise 1, let's say that all cantaloupe are pineapple. Premise 2, I'm eating cantaloupe. Conclusion, I'm eating pineapple. So here we have a logically valid argument where we can see, okay, if these premises were true, then the conclusion would necessarily follow. All right? So why is this argument wrong? Well, the argument is wrong because it is unsound. And what unsound means is that we can deny or we can refute a premise, okay, that the premises or a premise is not true. And so long as we can refute a premise, then we can avoid the conclusion. So, I mean, looking at this argument, all cantaloupe or pineapple, well, we have very good reason to believe that that is actually not true. These are different fruits. They taste different, they look different, they come from different plants, different places. They just aren't the same thing. And I'm not exactly a pomologist, but I'm sure a pomologist would attest to this. But premise number 2 is also false. I'm not eating cantaloupe. I'm drinking turmeric tea. So even if we granted the first premise, the second one isn't true. So therefore the conclusion is false. I'm not eating pineapple. I'm drinking tea. So the 2 big points I want to leave off with here for an argument, and then we'll do a quick summary, because I know I'm kind of covering a lot, and but these are just some basics. These are just some basics. If you keep these basics in mind, you'll do a lot better in debate with people, and you won't resort to silly logical fallacies, and maybe we can talk about a few of those as we move along. So, yes, for a deductive argument to be successful, it needs to have true premises. That means it needs to be sound, and the conclusion must necessarily follow. That means it needs to be valid. It must follow the rules of logic. Okay, that's all you really need. That's it. It's as simple as that. It's not actually all that simple. It's often tedious to construct good arguments, I think. But it's a worthwhile exercise. It makes you a better philosopher. So I highly recommend getting what you could do is you can start to look at assertions or arguments that people make and try to actually put them into a deductive or format to try and fit them into a syllogism, as this is often known. So if you're reading something and you want to say, is this a good argument, see if you can try and pull out what the first premise would be and the second premise, the major premise and the minor premise, and see if you can fit those into a conclusion, and then you can evaluate arguments within the context of a syllogism like this. And this is one of my favorite exercises when I'm going through books, especially philosophical books. I always try to pull out the arguments that are being made and form a syllogism of them and try to evaluate them that way. It's an interesting exercise. It's a good exercise, and so I will leave you with that. And let's see. So why did I spend so much time on that? Well, I spent so much time on that because I spend so much time arguing with people today and not hearing a lot of good arguments in return. I kept having to remind people that I was waiting for an argument or that wasn't an argument or things like that. So I think if you're going to engage in philosophy, if you're going to pay attention to philosophy, if you're going to do any of that, you should understand what makes for a good argument. And when I say if, I really mean just understand arguments, because we all engage in philosophy, whether we know it or not. We all hold opinions and beliefs and worldviews and positions about things, and that means that we all have or adhere to a philosophy, whether we think about it or not. And you might say, well, my philosophy is I don't have a philosophy. Well, guess what? That's still a philosophy, and you should provide arguments for that philosophy. So the question ultimately isn't, are you going to engage in philosophy? The question is, are you going to be a good philosopher or not? And I would say you should take the time to understand arguments so you are a good philosopher, because philosophy is inevitable. You're either bad at it, you're okay at it, you're good at it. Try to get good at it. It's better to be good at it than bad at it. And by the way, this little announcement to everyone who's listening here. WCAT TV is going to be born soon, and we are starting a series on there. I will be the host of it, called Philosophy for the People, where I will start to I'll teach a lot of what I'm talking about tonight. Actually, I think part of our first series will be how to make and develop good arguments, and then we'll give philosophical arguments for all the other interesting things, at least interesting to me: God's existence, objective moral values, the meaning of life, all these big questions, right? So yeah. That'll be really cool, and I don't have an exact release date on that yet, but it's coming at some point. It's a very exciting project. I'm really looking forward to it. So it'll be an extension of WCAT Radio, WCAT TV. So one more time before we get into the moral realm, if you want to join the conversation at any point, the phone number here is 515-604-9344. Access code 914121. I repeat. Number is 515-604-9344. Access code 914121. Funny story, I on my podcast today, the Pat Flynn Show, I mentioned secretly that I was a host of a radio show, and I didn't tell people what it was. I gave a few hints, and I got a number of emails, very impressively, of people who discovered this. They somehow did some Google searching, and they went out and they hunted. So if you're listening and you came from my podcast, you won something. I don't know what it is, but send me an email, and you definitely won something. Tomorrow I'm going to reveal what it actually is, but I wanted people to kind of have a little Easter egg hunt. So I was impressed. It's very good. All right. Let's talk about morality. Can you be good without God? That is the question, isn't it? Oh boy, oh boy. And this is, I've been engaged in apologetics and debate for a long time. And I've been on both sides of the spectrum. I was on the debate team in high school, always debated, loved debating in college, and now my life is pretty much full of debate. In fitness and exercise science, I constantly debate. I don't know if I've ever got a break from debating. But this experience has been very valuable to me, and when it comes to Christian apologetics and Catholic apologetics, I've really gotten a sense of arguments that are effective and persuasive. And I have to admit that for a while, some of the arguments that I thought were the best arguments ended up not being all that persuasive when I presented them in debates to other people or to classrooms or things like that. And I still maintain that I think these are great arguments. For example, the argument from contingency for the existence of God, or Lonergan's argument from intelligibility for the existence of God, or even just Aquinas' first way arguments. I think these are great arguments for the existence of God. But sometimes they take a lot of wind up. They're often technical arguments. So when you're trying to present them in a debate, or you're just having a discussion with somebody, there's a lot involved that, and I think that lends to their power, because they are technical arguments, but once you understand them, you realize they're really good arguments. And these arguments were what in great deal convinced me, by the way. So remember, I used to be one of those atheist philosophers. I used to be one of those existentialists. I didn't start where I am. I was brought over because I was presented with good arguments. But in my experience of apologetics, the argument that tends to get the most attention for people is not these arguments, and I'm not saying these arguments aren't ever successful. They certainly can be, but the one that really seems to smack people in the head is the moral argument, the argument of whether or not we can be good without God. And I think the reason this argument is so compelling for some people is because we have this properly basic belief of right and wrong. And so when you start to undermine that belief, right, with an atheistic worldview or naturalistic worldview, it's very repulsive to people. It is extremely repulsive to people when you draw out the nihilistic consequences of atheism, a lot of existentialism. And when I say existentialism, I'm kind of smuggling atheism into that. I realize that Christian existentialism existed for a little while, but existentialism usually implies atheism. Not always, but often. And when you start to draw out these conclusions, as I try to do in class, it's morally repugnant to people. People don't actually deep down want to subscribe to the idea that morals are all completely relativistic, that what Hitler did wasn't really wrong in an objective sense. What do I mean by objective sense? When I say objective, I mean that it's valid and binding, independent of any human opinion of it. That's what I mean by objectively right and objectively wrong, not subjectively right and subjectively wrong, meaning I think or I feel that it's right or wrong. So when I say that the Holocaust was objectively wrong, I mean even if all humans went extinct, it would still be wrong. Even if all humans thought that it was okay, it would still be wrong. That's what we mean by objective morality. There exists a realm of moral values that are valid and binding, independent of human experience or opinions about it. Okay, just to define terms. The relativist denies this. The relativist says that moral values are really, some would say they're illusory, or just based on our culture, society, preferences, tastes, etc. So when you draw the conclusion from this, you realize that moral values aren't objective, they aren't valid or binding, and so any set of moral values is really as valid as any other. So you can't, on this view, condemn something like the Holocaust as objectively wrong. The most you could really say is you just don't personally like it. And I found this to be a really good argument to argue for God's existence, because people do believe in objective moral values. People do believe there is something such as truly right and truly wrong. And then what I try to do is offer them the foundations to support that belief, which would be, of course, God and theism. So where do we start this argument? Well, I think there's a couple ways we can do it, and we'll blast away at relativism as we move through here. But I think there's a very good argument to be made for the existence of God off of objective moral values. So we just talked about how to make a good argument. Well, let's set one up with premises and a conclusion. And the moral argument is actually very, very simple. We can say something like, premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Now, this is the position of a naturalist and an atheist existentialist, right? They affirm moral relativism, and they affirm that God does not exist. So I would want to say that is their view. I don't want to battle or say that objective moral values do exist on atheism. I don't see any plausible reason how they could, and we can talk about some ideas maybe. So that's premise one. Premise one is if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Okay? What would premise two be? Premise two would be this. Objective moral values do exist. And so therefore it would follow with logical necessity that God exists. Okay? So it's a very simple argument. The logic is valid, and then all we have to do is affirm that the premises are more plausibly true than not. And if we can do that, then we have very good reason that God exists. This is a simple argument. So this is a way that you can begin to present this argument to people in a way that is easy to memorize and not that difficult to support. And the first premise could also be said another way. If God exists, then objective moral values exist. It's just saying the logical equivalent. But I like to say if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist, because that kind of twists the screws a little bit, right? It twists those emotional screws where people want to be like, no, no, no. What Hitler did was really wrong. Torturing babies is really wrong. People know this to be true. So, again, the first premise I don't think is that contentious. It's really not. Most Nietzsche would agree with that. A lot of the existentialist philosophers agree with that first premise. There are atheists who try to find objective values in something like humanism or something like that, but that is often a fundamental category mistake, and we can spend some time on that now. But I'd rather spend time first trying to support that second premise. Objective moral values exist. Because it seems to me that objective moral values are what we would call a properly basic belief. What is a properly basic belief? Well, a properly basic, and this is what I presented to the professor and the class, and I said this is why you shouldn't start from the position of relativism, because we have this properly basic belief, something that is so real and so true to our experience, which is this sense of truly right and truly wrong. And the notion of a properly basic belief in philosophy is this: if our faculties are aimed at truth and functioning properly, we are justified in holding to our basic experiential beliefs unless and until there arises some overriding defeater of those beliefs. I'll say it again. A properly basic belief is this: if our faculties are aimed at truth and functioning properly, we are completely justified in holding to our basic experiential beliefs unless and until there arises some overriding defeater. So what would some of these properly basic beliefs be? Well, I would say the existence of God is one. The experience of God seems absolutely to be a properly basic belief. And maybe we'll talk about that justification on another episode. But even more importantly would be the existence of the external world. This is absolutely a properly basic belief, right? It is so overwhelmingly evident to me that there exists a world outside of my head, that I am completely justified in accepting that position unless and until somebody can give me every good reason to believe that I am, for whatever reason, hooked up to the Matrix or what have you, and that everything outside of my head is an illusion, an invention, or a fantasy. I have never heard any such good reasons given. Therefore, we are perfectly justified in believing that there exists an objective outside physical world. And of course, we all really do believe this. We think about the outside world philosophically. We experimented on it scientifically. We live this properly basic belief, just like we live the properly basic belief of what? Of objective morality. We all have this very, very, like, as close as it can get to us, experience of a realm of truly right and truly wrong. And there is no reason that you should give this belief up unless and until somebody can give you every good reason to override it. And it seems to me like there are no good reasons to reject the idea of objective moral values. And we will examine some of the arguments that are typically given, and we will find, I believe, that these arguments are often extremely weak. Okay? Everybody with me so far on the idea of a properly basic belief? And the professor never even heard of this concept before, of a properly basic. This is like the first time that she heard of this. I was surprised about that. But it's important to understand that pretty much any argument that you run against objective moral values, we can run against the existence of the external world. So unless you're willing to deny that as well, and this is where we talk about dialing up that skepticism, becoming an extreme skeptic just to become a skeptic. But that doesn't mean that you're right just because you're being an extreme skeptic. Anybody can be an extreme skeptic on anything. Now, as one atheistic philosopher said, Louise Antony, who is a moral realist, interestingly enough. So she's an atheist, but she likes to affirm objective moral values. And we won't get into her position in particular, but she said this about the properly basic belief and why you are justified in holding to objective moral values. And she said that any argument for moral skepticism is based on premises less obvious than the reality of objective values itself. And that should pretty much sum it up. But we'll dig into some of the specific objections to objective morality. So the first one would be this, and it would be an attempt to explain away morality on evolution. And the reason that this isn't successful is because it is quite literally a textbook logical fallacy, which is known as the genetic fallacy. And what the genetic fallacy says is just because you know how you came to know a belief or hold a belief, that you have somehow successfully explained that belief away or explained that belief exhaustively. What are some examples of this? Well, say somebody came up to you and said that, hey, did you know 2 plus 2 equals 4? And you said, you know what? The only reason that you think 2 plus 2 equals 4 is because your brother told you that, and your brother is, as everybody knows, an idiot when it comes to math. And that might be true. It might be true that that person's brother is an idiot when it comes to math. But just because you know how that person came to hold that belief, even if it came from a dubious source, does nothing to show that that belief is false. We have to evaluate that belief independently of how we came to know about it. So it might be true. I'm not willing to fully concede that it is. I don't think evolution provides a fully adequate account of the moral sense. It can provide pretty decent accounts of certain impulses and behaviors, but that moral sense above and beyond certain instincts certainly does not have any really compelling basis in evolutionary science. But we can grant that premise. Even if we were able to explain it through evolution, that would still commit the genetic fallacy to say that explains moral values away. For example, we can run the same argument against the outside world. We can say how our senses developed through evolution to see the outside world. But just because we can explain how we came to detect the outside world through evolution, does that explain that the outside world doesn't exist? Well, obviously, I don't think that any of us would accept that it does. And we can see that this is clearly fallacious. It is literally the genetic fallacy being applied to morality. So we would say that we have evolved to discover the outside world and detect it. Well, the same absolutely could be, and I think is true for morality. Even if we came to our moral sense through the evolutionary process, we have every reason to suspect that objective moral values do exist, and we are discovering them rather than inventing them, especially if we believe our faculties are aimed at truth. Now, perhaps a naturalist or atheist will say, well, you know what, our faculties aren't aimed at truth. They're shaped by natural selection. And the problem with that is they saw off the branch that they were just sitting on. If you say that our faculties aren't aimed at truth, that they're just aimed at survival value, then you have no justification for that very belief. You've just undermined your own position. You can't justify rationally your own belief when you don't think that we have rationality to begin with. So the atheist philosopher is sort of in a quandary here. It has to either admit that our faculties are aimed at truth and affirm properly basic beliefs, or they have to deny that our faculties are aimed at truth and just deny every one of their beliefs, including the one just made. So these are a lot of the arguments that I presented in this class, and did people find them compelling? Convincing? I couldn't really tell you, but I think they are very good arguments, and especially when it comes to morality. So again, I like to twist the screws. I like to say that the consequences of an atheistic, existentialist worldview is as follows, and I just draw a line pretty much straight to nihilism. And we can get into that a little bit more as we move along. So the first objection to objective moral values would be to commit the classic logical fallacy of the genetic fallacy of just because you can explain something epistemologically that you think you've explained it ontologically, and that is just false. Another one that came up is the objection from diversity in moral practice, saying that since different cultures and individuals differ in certain moral practices, obviously objective morals don't exist. This is fallacious for a couple of reasons. Just because practices and interpretations of objective moral values exist doesn't mean that objective moral values do not exist, for example. So let me give you an example that I have from an article here, and I'll link it on the show notes if I can find it. Or back it up. Even more fundamentally than that, what we should say is that just because people disagree about something that exists doesn't mean that that something doesn't exist, right? So you and I might disagree about a certain mathematical equation, but that does nothing to deny the objective truth of that mathematical equation, whether I'm right or you're right. So we can disagree about something and we can interpret things differently, but that has nothing to do with whether or not that something actually exists objectively. But furthermore, it's important to understand that objective moral values can exist, and people can interpret those values in different ways, and I think they do interpret those values in different ways. So because sometimes people will be like, well, what about cannibals, right? What about those cannibals? Obviously, objective moral values can exist if cannibals are around, but here's the thing. They do have a sense of objective moral values, believe it or not. They do believe things like you should treat your neighbor with love and respect. The only difference is they don't interpret other tribes as being their neighbors. So they're just applying that objective value in a different way. I would argue in the wrong way that most of us would. So they still have these same values that we do. They just interpret them differently, and they just don't see the other tribes as their neighbors, so they eat them, which is unfortunate. And that's why we should have ethical and moral theories for how we can derive these objective moral values and truths. But again, just because we disagree on what those objective moral values and truths may be doesn't mean that they don't exist. I would argue that they absolutely do. So it's just an inadequate argument to say that because people hold different applications of moral principles, that somehow undermines the nature of objective moral values to begin with. It just is not a successful argument. And in fact, the more we study different cultures and societies, we see an incredible and overwhelming commonality of shared values across the board, like modesty, for example. Obviously, different cultures we wouldn't say are modest, but then when you really start to study, you see, oh, they do believe in modesty. They just express it differently. So it's important to understand the distinction there. And then finally, the last one, before we get specifically into the problems of relativism and how to respond to that, is the argument from tolerance, is that it's somehow intolerant to promote objective moral values because you're just, you're not including people who have different moral views than you. But I hope right away that you see why this position is just totally untenable on relativism, because you would have to affirm on relativism that there exists at least one objective value, tolerance. So to the extent that you think that tolerance is somehow an objective moral value, that it's and even if it's just the only one, well, you're no longer a moral relativist. So these were the arguments that came up in class, and I thought that they were easily dismissed, and not as a discredit to anybody who held those arguments. There were a lot of smart people, but it's a hard position to defend. I think it is radically incoherent moral relativism. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that if we go back to the argument, if God does not exist, objective moral values do exist, and if we can defend premise 2 that objective moral values do exist, that we are well within our rational rights to accept those properly based beliefs, just like we accept the existence of the external world, it affirms to us the conclusion that God exists. So let's turn now to relativism specifically. I have a sheet of notes here from my various studies of relativism, of the problem with relativism in specifically. And I have seven points here that I think are really important. If you ever get into an argument with a moral relativist, these are the 7 points I think that you want to bring up. And I forget where I started to assemble these at first. It's on a really poor looking piece of paper, but hopefully I can read my handwriting. But I think I fairly have these objections memorized at this point anyways. So And I find that these points are often, again, very convincing to people because our moral intuitions, our properly basic beliefs, pretty much rebel against all of these implications of moral relativism. And to the extent that you can really bang against somebody's moral conscience with a moral viewpoint, the more likely I think they are to reject that moral viewpoint, and rightfully so. I think relativism should be chucked out the window, hopefully forever. So if we can just accomplish that, I think we'll have made great moral progress, which is one of the first points of relativism. If you're a relativist, you cannot talk about moral progress because there's no such thing as moral progress on relativism. At most, you could have moral change. Again, if morals are completely relative and there's not an objective or binding morality at all, then any one person's or any one society's morality is valid, I would say as invalid as anybody else's. So we can't talk about moral progress. We can't say that that Germany has morally progressed since Hitler. It just doesn't make sense on relativism. And of course, nobody with a properly functioning moral intuition would ever admit to that. We would all admit that Germany has made moral progress since the Holocaust. So that's one thing to point out to the person who promotes relativism, is you cannot talk anything about moral progress. At best, you could just talk about moral change. Relativists can also never say anything is something inherently evil, mind you. Because again, on relativism, there is no objective right and wrong. There is no objective good and evil. What is moral is really a matter of taste and preference. Evil simply does not exist. So you cannot condemn. I'm going to keep using the Holocaust example because it's so. It's the Holocaust. What do you need to say about it? It's so evil. It's absolutely evil. But you can't say that on relativism. Well, fortunately, most people have the intuition to know that it's evil, and that it's evil regardless of what anybody thinks about it. But relativists cannot coherently make that claim. Furthermore, they cannot complain about evil when it comes to God. This is really important. Oftentimes, atheists or whatever will object to God by pointing at evil, to be like, hey, if God exists, then why is there so much evil in the world? But on relativism, there is no such thing as evil. So if you're going to affirm evil, you then have to go around and affirm God. You can't have it both ways. If you're going to try to refute God with evil, you've just done a runaround and affirmed God. You can't use evil as an argument against God and maintain a relativist perspective on morality. It's just not available to you. I find that to always be one of the most interesting objections. So I hope that's pretty clear what I said. Again, since evil itself it falls out from objective moral values. To say something is objectively good or evil, we can't say that on relativism, because somebody might just have a different opinion or feeling about what is right and wrong, and who are you to say that that's evil? You just don't like it. So you can't use evil to complain about God on relativism. It just doesn't work. Relativists really cannot either accept praise or blame for anything they do. So this professor was a relativist. She goes out and she champions a lot of causes that are important to her, but I don't see any reason to say that that's a good thing on relativism. And this is a really important point that I'll make. When it comes to things like moral relativism, I'm just not convinced that the vast majority of relativists really are relativists. I'm just not convinced. Unless you are truly and thoroughly a nihilist and looking at the absurdity of life and straight in the face, and committing really and truly atrocious acts, I'm not sure that I'm entirely convinced that your position is a relativist. And thank goodness for that, because the moral hold, the God hold, if you will, is so strong that it prevents people from doing that, even if they deny that it exists. So thank God for objective moral values and the appearance of them to our conscience. But, I mean, for example, the relativists who go out and champion certain causes are acting in such a way that they at least feel and believe that these causes are worth pursuing, that they are good, right? And you press them on it, they might admit that it's arbitrary and that their promotion of something like feminism is really no more valid than the promotion of cannibalism or bestiality. But again, talk about raising the intellectual stakes. Who wants to admit that? But you would have to admit that on relativism. So relativists can't accept praise, but they also can't place blame either. Really important. It's just not a viable option on relativism. And relativists can't become better people, right? If everything is relative, again, there's no progress, so there's no point in trying to become a better person on relativism, right? It's all relative. It's all subjective. Who's to say what a better person even is? There's no objective standard of goodness. So there's no way to say that we're getting better or worse. At most, we can just say that we are changing. So there's no sense in talking like, oh, I'm becoming a better person, I'm trying to be more honest or truthful. Hey, you're sneaking in objective morality again. Don't do that. It also means that relativists really can't hold meaningful conversations about morality, which I brought it up. I said as a relativist class, of moral relativist class, all these conversations are ultimately meaningless. We've undermined the point of even having this class by starting from a relativistic standpoint. I just don't see, if there's no moral progress to be made, if we can't better ourselves morally, if we can't better society morally, then how can we have any meaningful moral conversations if all morality boils down to what people just prefer? Why not go with what the psychopaths prefer? I don't know. I haven't really heard many good arguments against that. And then finally, hopefully I didn't skip one, but again, the idea of tolerance. So many of the relativists promote the position on tolerance. And as we said before, to promote tolerance is, again, to at least admit to one objective moral value. And to do that, it takes you right out of relativism. So, all right, we are pretty much wrapped up here. We've covered a lot today. So what did we talk about? Oh, man, we talked about why philosophy is important. You're going to do philosophy no matter what, so you might as well learn to do it well. What makes for a good argument? Talked a little bit about deductive reasoning. And then we talked about, can you be moral without God? So what is the conclusion to this? The conclusion is that you can be moral without belief in God. Of course you can. But you cannot be moral without God. You cannot be good without God. Now people will be like, oh, that's so arrogant for you to say that because I'm an atheist I can't be a good person. No, you can be a good person, but you can only be a good person because God exists. Whether you believe in him or not is irrelevant. And I think we have affirmed that, or at least strongly supported it with the moral argument. And we'll dig more into this and maybe talk about some common objections in a future episode. I don't want to make it seem like I've presented the case entirely or exhaustively. Obviously, there's ways that various people can respond to it, but this is a very basic outline that I hope is helpful to you, because, again, I was going at it for 4 hours today, battling relativism and existentialists and this and that, and these were some of the tools that I had at my disposal that I found to be quite effective. And I wanted to pass those on to you because this is not only a good apologetic tool to help spread your faith coming from the moral angle, because, again, this is a properly basic belief. We all want to affirm that there is a such thing as truly right and truly wrong. And relativism is just permeating the culture right now. I really am surprised and alarmed at how many people are adopting this utterly bankrupt worldview, if I might be so frank about it. But we'll leave it at that. A few recommendations if you want to do some further reading. Again, head over to enroutebooksandmedia.com. Check out Moral Psychology by Peter Redpath. That's the Moral Psychology of Thomas Aquinas. Francis Canavan's Fun is Not Enough, also over at enroutebooksandmedia.com. Fun is not enough. Study up on this stuff. It is it's important. These are important arguments. They are powerful arguments. They're going to help you advance they're going to help you as an evangelist, right? That the moral sense in humans is so strong. So let's appeal to that. And I'll just finish by saying that, again, in all the debates and discussions I've had, it's been a lot at this point, I have found that coming from a moral angle is just really, really convincing. And I'll finish off with a little story. When I first read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, I was curious why he started with the moral argument, because I will say that the moral argument isn't what convinced me out of atheism. I wasn't that interested in it. But as I have gotten into more dialogues and debates, I fully understand it now. I think the reason he presented the moral argument first in Mere Christianity is because it's the one that people pay most attention to. It tends to be very effective for helping people to come back to a sense of objective moral values and belief in God. So we'll leave it with that. Folks, you can catch me this week over at the Pat Flynn Show as my podcast, and we will see you next Monday, same time, same place. I'll be in the same place. You might be in a different place. We'll see you then. Thanks for tuning in, folks.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.